I need to do this for my family. This is not a surprise to anybody. Pretty gutted about this.
For years, Meghan Markle's story has been told through palace briefings, explosive interviews, biographies, and royal commentators. But one voice carried a different kind of weight the family name Diana was born with. And when that voice finally entered the conversation, the comparison became impossible to ignore. The Spencer name has never been just another aristocratic name in the royal story. It carries the memory of Princess Diana, a woman adored by millions, yet remembered just as powerfully for the loneliness, pressure, and conflict that followed her behind palace walls. That history gives Charles Spencer a position unlike almost anyone else drawn into the debate surrounding Harry and Meghan. He stands outside the formal structure of the monarchy, free from its official duties and carefully controlled language, yet he remains tied by blood to one of the institution's most painful and unresolved chapters. That alone meant that if he ever chose to speak about Meghan, his words would land differently. For years, Diana's legacy had hovered over almost every argument involving Harry. Her public battles, her uneasy relationship with royal expectations, and the relentless attention surrounding her life became impossible to separate from the way Harry later described his own fears. When Meghan entered the royal family, those old wounds seemed to stir again. The circumstances were different, but the emotional echoes were powerful enough to ignite a comparison that neither the palace nor the public could easily contain. Scrutiny grew. Expectations tightened. Every disagreement became bigger than the disagreement itself. And Harry was no detached observer. Diana's death had shaped his childhood, his distrust, and eventually his determination to protect his own family on his own terms. After he and Meghan stepped back from royal duties, nearly every major decision they made was examined through that same painful lens. Was Harry escaping a system he feared would repeat the past? Or was he allowing that past to dominate the present? Through all of this, Charles Spencer appeared cautious. Journalists spoke. Former courtiers spoke. Historians, friends, critics, and royal experts all offered judgments. Yet Diana's brother largely remained outside the loudest part of the Meghan argument, and that restraint only made the possibility of his intervention more intriguing. Because if Spencer finally broke that silence, nobody knew what would follow. Would he defend Meghan as someone facing pressures Diana might have recognized? Would he challenge the comparisons altogether? Would he warn Harry that grief was influencing choices with consequences he could not yet see? Or would he offer something far more unsettling? A perspective that satisfied neither supporters nor critics. Royal observers understood the stakes. Any serious connection drawn between Meghan's experience and Diana's could reopen questions the monarchy had spent decades trying to move beyond. But before his words could carry their full weight, one uncomfortable question had to be confronted. Why had Meghan and Diana been compared so relentlessly in the first place? The comparisons began almost immediately, but they were never simple. Diana had entered the monarchy young and inexperienced. Meghan arrived with a career, a voice, and a completely different understanding of public life. Yet beneath those differences, Harry believed he saw something hauntingly familiar, and that belief changed everything. Diana's story had always carried a painful contradiction. She was loved on a scale few royal figures ever experienced, yet behind that affection sat a system defined by rank, restraint, discipline, and the expectation that personal turmoil should remain hidden. The more the public embraced her, the more exposed her private struggles seemed to become. She was celebrated, judged, protected, criticized, and watched, all at once. It was that collision between affection and pressure that later made comparisons with Meghan so emotionally powerful. But Meghan had entered royal life under very different circumstances. She was older, professionally established, accustomed to making her own decisions, and already familiar with public attention before marrying Harry. Diana had been much younger when she stepped into royal duty, learning its rules while the world watched. The two women were not living the same story. Still, once Meghan began facing relentless headlines, intense scrutiny, and questions about whether she truly belonged inside royal life, the similarities became impossible for many people to ignore. For Harry, those similarities seemed to carry a deeper meaning. His fear was never necessarily that every detail of Diana's life would repeat itself. It was that the emotional machinery might. The pressure, the isolation, the constant judgment. The possibility that someone he loved could become overwhelmed while the institution around them appeared unable or unwilling to stop the damage. That belief turned Diana's memory into a battlefield. Supporters of Harry and Meghan saw echoes of old mistakes and argued that the warning signs were obvious. Critics pushed back, insisting that comparing Meghan with Diana inflated ordinary royal tensions into something far darker. Suddenly, every disagreement became part of a larger historical argument, and Diana's name was pulled into battles she had never lived to witness. For William and Harry, the danger was intensely personal. Diana was not merely a public symbol. She was their mother, yet her memory increasingly became attached to two very different interpretations of monarchy, duty, protection, and survival. That was why the Spencer family occupied such a delicate position. They had not observed Diana's struggles from a television studio or palace briefing room. They had lived beside the consequences. Charles Spencer knew Diana as a sister before the world turned her into an icon. And that meant his perspective could challenge everyone. Because the deeper question was no longer whether Meghan was another Diana. It was what happened when private grief, family loyalty, and old wounds became ammunition in a public war. And that was where the story began to shift away from comparisons between two women and toward the deeper wound connecting Harry, his mother's family, and the institution he once called home. Behind every public statement, legal battle, interview, and dramatic departure was a fear Harry had carried since childhood, the possibility that someone he loved could be swallowed by the same machinery he believed had damaged his mother. Whether others agreed hardly mattered. To Harry, the fear was real. That fear did not begin with Meghan. It had been forming for years, shaped by memories of Diana living beneath extraordinary pressure while her private pain became public conversation. Harry had grown up watching the consequences of that exposure, and as an adult, he seemed determined not to remain passive if he believed the same forces were closing around his own family. Meghan's struggles, therefore, became something larger in his mind. They were no longer simply disagreements with courtiers, difficult headlines, or clashes over royal expectations. They touched an older wound. And yet, Harry faced an impossible contradiction. He wanted distance from the scrutiny surrounding royal life, but he remained part of a family whose existence depended on public duty, tradition, symbolism, and attention. Even after stepping away, the connection could not simply be switched off. His name still carried royal weight. His decisions still affected the institution. Meghan, meanwhile, became more than his wife in the public argument. She became connected to everything Harry had never resolved about the monarchy, the press, and the memory of his mother. Leaving did not silence the conflict. In many ways, it amplified it. Interviews brought new revelations. Public accusations created fresh disputes. Harry's memoir reopened old grievances. Legal battles kept the press at the center of the story. Every attempt to explain why they had left seemed to generate another wave of commentary about what had happened before. That was where Charles Spencer's position became unusually important. He could potentially understand Harry's fear in a way few others could. He had witnessed the pressure surrounding Diana from inside the family circle. But understanding a fear was not the same as approving every decision made because of it. That distinction was crucial. Because a disturbing question now hovered over the story. Was Harry protecting Meghan from the repetition of history, or was his determination to prevent that repetition allowing Diana's memory to become permanently woven into another bitter family conflict? Royal experts knew that any answer from Spencer would immediately be examined for hidden meaning. Was he siding with Harry? Protecting William? Distancing the Spencer family from Meghan? Or warning everyone that the argument itself had become dangerous? The silence could not last forever. And once Diana's brother stepped closer to the debate, every carefully drawn battle line suddenly looked less certain. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for, the first indication that Diana's brother was prepared to address Meghan directly. And his message was not the simple endorsement or condemnation either side expected. When Charles Spencer finally addressed the subject, the shock was not that he chose a side. It was that he appeared to reject the entire idea that Diana's memory should belong to one side at all. Suddenly, the royal argument surrounding Meghan looked very different. His approach, in this dramatized telling, was careful from the beginning. There was no explosive accusation, no dramatic declaration of loyalty, no attempt to turn Diana's memory into a weapon. Instead, Spencer appeared to recognize how dangerous that territory had become. Diana's name carried enormous emotional power, and every time it was pulled into the modern conflict surrounding Harry and Meghan, the past seemed to become part of the present all over again. He could understand why Harry saw echoes of his mother's experience in Meghan's struggles. The relentless headlines, the public judgment, the sense of being watched, analyzed, and reduced to competing narratives. For Harry, those similarities were emotional before they were factual. They touched something deeply personal. Spencer seemed to understand that instinct. But understanding it was not the same as accepting every comparison. Diana's life, he suggested, could not simply become a template placed over every disagreement involving Meghan. The circumstances were different. The personalities were different. The monarchy itself had changed. To pretend otherwise risked turning Diana from a complicated human being into a symbol used to prove whichever argument people already wanted to make. And Spencer's sympathy for Meghan did not erase that distinction. He could acknowledge the pressure she experienced without declaring that she had lived Diana's story again. He could recognize the damage caused by cruelty while also questioning whether endless public confrontation truly healed anything. That was the uncomfortable line running through his message. Protecting someone from unfair treatment was one thing. Allowing private wounds to become permanent public warfare was another. And somewhere between those two realities stood Harry and William, brothers increasingly separated by arguments involving duty, loyalty, memory, and the woman they both lost. Perhaps that was the deepest sadness behind Spencer's words. Diana's greatest personal legacy was not a title, a palace, or global fame. It was her sons. And now those sons appeared to be carrying the same grief in completely different directions. Royal commentators immediately understood the significance. This was not a straightforward attack on Meghan. It was not an unquestioning defense of Harry either. Spencer was disturbing the comfortable battle lines that had formed around the Sussex story. Yet one question still remained unanswered. And then he reached the question everyone had been waiting for. After everything that had happened, what did Diana's brother actually think of Meghan Markle? The answer was more complicated than anyone expected. Spencer did not portray Meghan as a villain. he did not declare her Diana's successor. Instead, he described a woman who entered an institution carrying impossible expectations and warned that the real tragedy might lie in what happened afterward. In this dramatized account, Spencer's position was clear on one point above all others: Meghan had to be understood as Meghan. Not as a replacement for Diana. Not as a continuation of Diana's story. And not as a symbol onto which every old royal wound could be projected. She had entered one of the most tradition-bound families in the world while already carrying an international profile, strong opinions, and expectations of her own. That alone guaranteed pressure. But once every struggle began to be measured against Diana's experience, the burden became even heavier. Spencer could also understand Harry's instinct to protect. He had witnessed what happened when criticism, private tension, media obsession, and public judgment began feeding one another around Diana. Those forces could turn rapidly, transforming personal difficulties into something far larger and harder to control. For Harry, protecting Meghan may have felt less like a choice and more like a promise to himself. But that was where Spencer's warning became sharper. If Harry and Meghan continued to interpret every battle through Diana's past, were they escaping history, or becoming trapped inside it? The comparison may have offered emotional meaning, but it also risked giving every disagreement the weight of tragedy. And once that happened, compromise became almost impossible. The most painful part of Spencer's message centered not on Meghan, but on Diana's sons. Whatever else Diana had represented to the world, she wanted William and Harry to build lives beyond the grief attached to her name. To imagine that same grief now sitting between them, hardened into resentment and distance, carried its own quiet devastation. Spencer's view did not offer easy innocence or easy blame. The palace had consequences to face. The press had consequences to face. Harry and Meghan had choices of their own to answer for. So did the wider royal circle. Pride, silence, defensiveness, and public accusation could all become part of the same destructive cycle. And Meghan had become caught at the center of it. To some, she represented resistance to outdated traditions. To others, she became the face of royal division. Yet many of those fractures had existed long before she arrived. That was perhaps Spencer's strongest warning. Once private pain becomes a global argument, reconciliation starts to look like defeat. Every apology can appear like surrender. Every silence can look like guilt. And the moment those words entered the wider royal conversation, experts began interpreting them in completely different ways. Within hours, royal experts began pulling his words apart, and what followed revealed just how divided the monarchy's observers had become. The reaction was immediate. Some experts claimed Spencer had quietly challenged Harry's use of Diana's legacy. Others insisted he had exposed the palace's failure to understand Meghan's emotional reality. The same words produced completely opposite conclusions, and suddenly, the debate was more explosive than before. What had sounded like a plea for perspective quickly became another royal battleground. One group seized on Spencer's warning about Diana's memory, arguing that Harry could not keep using his mother's suffering as the emotional framework for every modern conflict. To them, the message was unmistakable. Grief could explain Harry's choices, but it could not automatically justify them. If every disagreement was tied back to Diana, then no argument could ever remain in the present. But another camp heard something entirely different. They focused on Spencer's apparent sympathy for Meghan and the pressures she had faced. Someone who had watched Diana endure years of relentless attention, they argued, would understand how public criticism could become deeply personal, even destructive. From that perspective, Spencer had not challenged Harry's fear. He had validated the emotional reason behind it. Then came a third interpretation. quieter, but perhaps more unsettling. Some experts suggested Meghan was not the real center of Spencer's message at all. William and Harry were. Diana's memory had become caught between them, attached to different ideas of duty, loyalty, protection, and survival. What one brother saw as honoring their mother, the other could interpret as distorting her legacy. And that made the argument almost impossible to resolve. Inside the dramatized palace narrative, silence only deepened the tension. No formal response was required. In fact, saying nothing may have seemed safer. But royal silence has rarely stopped speculation. Every absence of comment became another detail to interpret. Was the palace dismissing Spencer's remarks, concerned by them, or simply refusing to give the controversy more oxygen? Sussex supporters said the message proved Harry had been right to fear history repeating itself. Critics countered that Spencer had warned against allowing trauma to become a permanent public identity. Both sides believed they had heard confirmation. And that was the bitter irony. A message urging restraint created even more headlines. A warning against turning private hurt into public warfare became fresh ammunition for exactly that warfare. Yet beneath the arguments, something more personal was beginning to surface. The real consequence of Spencer's words might not be measured in polls, headlines, or television debates. It might be felt in the relationship between two brothers already separated by years of hurt. Because beneath the commentary and headlines, Spencer's words touched a far more painful subject: two brothers who inherited the same grief but learned completely different ways to survive it. William and Harry lost the same mother, but grief did not lead them down the same road. One remained inside the institution Diana once struggled against. The other walked away from it. And now her memories seemed to stand silently between them, powerful enough to unite them or divide them forever. William's path became increasingly tied to duty. He was raised not simply as Diana's son, but as a future king expected to protect continuity, stability, and the institution itself. That responsibility demanded restraint. It required him to live inside the very system that had once caused his mother so much pain, while also believing that the monarchy could survive, adapt, and remain worth defending. Harry moved in another direction. His choices became more closely associated with emotional openness, independence, hostility towards sections of the press, and a willingness to challenge traditions he believed had failed his family before. Where William seemed to accept the burden of remaining inside the structure, Harry increasingly questioned whether staying inside it was the greater danger. Meghan did not create that difference. She intensified it. Her arrival brought old tensions into sharper focus. Every disagreement over press treatment, palace expectations, security, loyalty, or public image became attached to questions that had existed between the brothers long before she entered Harry's life. And once Diana's memory became part of those arguments, the emotional stakes rose dramatically. That was why Spencer's message carried such uncomfortable force. Diana could not belong to only one interpretation. She was not exclusively the symbol of royal duty, nor solely the symbol of rebellion against it. William could not claim that remaining within the monarchy was the only way to honor her. Harry could not claim that rejecting its traditions was the only lesson her life had left behind. Yet, both men may have felt precisely that. For William, repeated comparisons between Meghan and Diana could be deeply painful because they risked turning his mother's suffering into an argument against the institution he had chosen to serve. For Harry, refusing those comparisons could feel equally painful, almost as if the warnings he believed Diana's life had taught him were being erased. And therein lay the tragedy. Both brothers could genuinely believe they were protecting their mother's legacy while moving further away from each other. Meghan remained caught inside that unresolved conflict. Every decision she made could be interpreted through wounds she did not create, loyalties formed before she arrived, and grief that had shaped Harry and William for decades. The deeper the argument became, the harder it was to separate Meghan from Diana, Harry from the past, or William from the crown. And that left one final question hanging over everything Spencer had said. Could Diana's memory ever become a bridge again? Or had it already become another battlefield in the royal family's deepest fracture? In the end, Charles Spencer's message did not settle the argument around Meghan Markle. It exposed why the argument refuses to die. This was never only about one duchess, one prince, or one palace dispute. It was about memory, grief, loyalty, and a family still living beneath Diana's shadow. Meghan's experience had become inseparable from Harry's instinct to protect, just as Harry's choices had become inseparable from the pain he carried from childhood. William, meanwhile, remained tied to duty, continuity, and the future of the institution itself. Between them stood Diana's memory, deeply personal, endlessly public, and interpreted in completely different ways. That was what made Spencer's dramatized position so disruptive. It refused the easy story. Meghan was not simply the victim some believed her to be, nor the cause of every royal fracture as others claimed. Harry was not merely a wounded son, and the monarchy was not simply a cold machine. Every side carried its own fears, mistakes, loyalties, and consequences. For Harry, the deepest fear may never have been losing titles, popularity, or royal approval. It may have been something far more intimate, the possibility of watching his own family suffer while believing he had failed to act. In his mind, protecting Meghan could become tied to a promise born from what happened to Diana. But the monarchy carried a fear of its own. Institutions survive through continuity, restraint, and trust. When private grievances become permanent public identities, every dispute threatens to outlive the people who started it. Resentment becomes inheritance, silence becomes suspicion, and family conflict turns into history. Meghan remained in an almost impossible position. Every similarity drawn between her and Diana intensified expectations. Every difference was used to attack the comparison. She could never fully escape a story that began years before she entered Harry's life. Perhaps Spencer's most powerful contribution, then, was not choosing a side. It was reminding everyone that Diana had been a person before she became a symbol. Her pain, her mistakes, her love, and her legacy could not endlessly be reduced to ammunition in battles she never lived to see. And at the center remained William and Harry, two sons carrying the same loss in opposite directions, while the world continued searching their mother's memory for answers to every new disagreement. Whether Spencer's intervention would disappear into another cycle of headlines or force a deeper reconsideration remained uncertain. The darker possibility was harder to dismiss. History did not need to repeat itself exactly for the damage to continue. A new generation could still become trapped inside an old tragedy simply because nobody learned how to stop fighting over what that tragedy meant. Because until Harry, William, Meghan, and the monarchy decide what Diana's legacy means without using it against one another, the past will remain exactly where it has always been, not behind them, but standing quietly in the middle of everything.